What if I told you that the trade war isn't about trade at all? Behind the headlines, behind the tariffs and border taxes, lies a deeper strategy, one that has little to do with economics and everything to do with power. Economist Michael Hudson believes Donald Trump's tariff policies are more than campaign promises or protectionist gestures. They're part of a broader financial battle, a war between classes, currencies, and competing world orders. In this video, we unpack Hudson's bold claim that these tariffs are tools of domestic class warfare and global restructuring. They aren't just targeting China, they're targeting the American working class, shifting wealth upward while reshaping the very foundations of global finance. Is this economic nationalism or economic theater, a path to sovereignty, or a cover for systemic control? To find out, we'll go deep into history, currency creation, and international trade politics, from Lincoln's greenbacks to the rise of China's credit power. You've heard the headlines. Now let's decode the real agenda behind the tariffs. Hudson argues that Trump's tariffs aren't just anti-China, they're anti-worker. Framed as protection for U.S. industry, they actually serve as tools in a wider class war. The beneficiaries? Major corporations, financiers, and the ultra-wealthy. The losers? Workers, consumers, in the middle class. Hudson calls it economic nationalism for the 1%. Tariffs drive up prices, isolate supply chains, and ultimately reduce bargaining power for labor. It's not just globalization being reversed, it's power being restructured. Unlike traditional protectionism, which historically sought to build up domestic industries and shield fledgling sectors, Trump's tariffs operate more like a blunt economic instrument. The goal isn't development, it's dominance. Corporations pass higher costs to consumers. Multinational suppliers adapt by shifting production offshore, but not necessarily back to the U.S. Labor sees no benefit. Only price hikes, stagnant wages, and uncertainty. Meanwhile, financial markets cheer. Investors profit from volatility. Speculators make gains off chaos. And working families? They tighten their belts. Hudson points to the illusion of strength. These tariffs are sold as patriotic, but in reality, he says, they hollow out the middle and feed the top. It's class warfare disguised as economic sovereignty, and millions of Americans are caught in the middle without even knowing they're on the battlefield. To truly understand today's tariff debate, we have to rewind history, not to 2016, but to the 1800s. Tariffs have always been part of the American economic playbook, but the way they've been used and who they've served has shifted dramatically. In the 19th century, tariffs were central to the rise of the American industrial economy. Politicians like Alexander Hamilton and later Henry Clay championed tariffs not as punishment, but as scaffolding to protect U.S. manufacturers from European dominance while they matured. It worked. From textiles to steel, America built its own capacity under a shield of high import duties. These tariffs were tied to nation building with the explicit goal of economic independence and middle-class creation. But Hudson argues that today's tariffs are fundamentally different, not protective, but extractive. Instead of stimulating domestic production, they create volatility that favors financial speculation. Instead of rebuilding industries, they reward firms with global operations and offshore labor. This shift isn't accidental, it's ideological. It reflects a deeper transformation in the American economy, from industrial capitalism to finance capitalism. In the former, tariffs were tools for productivity. In the latter, they're weapons for profit. Hudson highlights a key turning point. The Reagan era. With deregulation and globalization accelerating, tariffs became political symbols rather than coherent strategies. Clinton's NAFTA and later WTO integration further eroded the old industrial tariff logic. Trump's approach, Hudson says, revives the language of nationalism, but in service of capital concentration, not community resilience. The historical irony is sharp. Tariffs once built America's middle class. Today, they may be helping dismantle it. It's not that tariffs can't work, it's that they've been re-engineered to serve different masters. Beyond tariffs, Hudson points to an even more fundamental issue: who controls the money and how it's used. Throughout American history, the government has wielded the power to issue currency in moments of national need. Abraham Lincoln issued the greenback during the Civil War. Franklin D. Roosevelt expanded money creation to fund the New Deal. During World War II, war bonds financed massive mobilization. In each of these cases, money wasn't merely a medium of exchange, it was a tool of statecraft, a strategic force. Today, Hudson argues, the United States has largely ceded that power to private banking institutions and the bond market. Instead of printing money for public investment, the state borrows it, often at the cost of rising debt and austerity measures. Meanwhile, China has gone in the opposite direction. It issues sovereign credit to finance infrastructure, technology, and industrial expansion. The People's Bank of China functions not only as a central bank, but as a development engine. Hudson draws the comparison starkly. Where the U.S. funds speculation, China funds production. Where the U.S. inflates asset bubbles, China builds railroads and power plants. Tariffs in this light are not just about goods crossing borders. They're about who gets to shape the future. The country that controls credit creation, strategically and publicly, will dominate global influence. This raises a deeper question. What is money really? Is it a neutral market force or a political weapon? Hudson is clear. It's the latter. He explains that modern monetary theory, MMT, has shown how sovereign nations with their own currencies are never truly revenue constrained. They can fund anything, if the political will exists. In Hudson's view, tariffs are being used to distract from this reality. They obscure the fact that the U.S. government could, if it chose, finance domestic industry, housing, healthcare, and green energy without relying on regressive taxes or market-based debt. But that would require a shift in ideology, from neoliberalism to national development, from Wall Street priorities to public purpose. Instead, we get trade wars, symbolic gestures that pretend to reclaim sovereignty while quietly reinforcing financial dependency. Hudson's warning is blunt. If you don't control your currency, you don't control your destiny. By now, the domestic effects of Trump's tariffs are clear. Higher prices, greater inequality, and a redirection of wealth upward. But what about the rest of the world? According to Michael Hudson, the international repercussions of U.S. tariff policies are no less dramatic and potentially even more dangerous. From Europe to Asia to Latin America, countries are being forced to rethink their economic alliances, diversify their trade routes, and question the reliability of the United States as a global economic leader. The post-World War II economic order, shaped by American dominance, is fracturing, and the pressure is coming from within. In Europe, traditional allies are frustrated. The EU, once a core U.S. trade partner, is now navigating tariffs on steel, autos, and agricultural goods. European leaders have responded with countermeasures, but more importantly, with long-term plans to reduce reliance on U.S. markets. Germany, France, and even the UK are exploring closer ties with China and diversifying energy supply chains to reduce dollar dependency. The result? A subtle but accelerating shift away from the Atlantic economy and toward a more multipolar trade landscape. In Asia, the response is even more decisive. Countries in the ASEAN bloc, along with South Korea and Japan, are hedging their bets. They're increasing trade with China and forming regional pacts like RCEP to insulate themselves from U.S. volatility. Latin America, long viewed as a geopolitical backyard by Washington, is exploring new trade models with Brazil, leading efforts to strengthen South-South cooperation and reduce reliance on U.S. imports in the dollar-based system. Hudson argues that in trying to assert dominance, the United States is accelerating its own marginalization. The more tariffs are used as threats, the more other nations seek autonomy, not just in trade, but in finance. Central banks from Brazil to India are buying gold. China and Russia are building alternative payment systems to SWIFT. BRICS nations are discussing new reserve currencies. The world is responding to U.S. policy not with compliance, but with innovation. The irony is thick. In trying to punish its rivals, America may be empowering them. In trying to protect its economy, it may be undermining its own role in the global system. And the consequences could be long-term. A weakened dollar, fragmented trade routes, financial bifurcation between East and West, and perhaps most significantly, a loss of trust. Hudson warns that tariffs, when weaponized, create blowback. Allies become skeptics, neutrals become competitors, and adversaries become architects of new systems. Trade in the 21st century is not just about goods, it's about alignment. And with every new tariff, the U.S. risks isolating itself from a world that is no longer willing to follow its lead. In the end, the question is no longer whether tariffs will work. It's whether America can afford their consequences. As we approach the end of this breakdown, one unavoidable question remains. Is this really about trade policy? Or is it about something much deeper, a restructuring of power inside the U.S. and across the global economy? Michael Hudson doesn't mince words. For him, tariffs are merely the surface symptoms of a larger economic realignment, one that pits class against class and sovereign models of development against financialized dependency. Hudson argues that we are witnessing a quiet revolution, a reshuffling of economic rules that isn't happening through protest or uprising, but through policy, a class war from above, where power doesn't need to be seized, it's gradually tilted. He draws a line between historical industrial policy, where governments use taxes, credit, and protectionist tools to strengthen national economies, and today's use of those same tools to protect the wealth of a small elite. In this new model, tariffs aren't aimed at rebuilding domestic production. They're designed to consolidate economic control. The state props up monopolies, credit flows upward, regulations are rewritten to serve those already at the top. The middle class is hollowed out, labor protections are diluted, social mobility shrinks, and public infrastructure, once seen as a national investment, is turned into private profit. Hudson warns that this is not a bug of the system, it is the system, a finance-dominated economy that relies on asset inflation, debt dependency, and political distraction to keep itself alive. Tariffs in this world are not the problem. They are a feature. They stir up national sentiment while disguising the real agenda: to redistribute power, not between nations, but between economic classes. He calls it neo-feudalism in a neoliberal suit, a world where workers compete globally while capital moves freely, where trade barriers rise not to protect jobs, but to extract value. Hudson's final point is chilling. You don't need a revolution to change who holds power in a society. You just need a consistent set of policies that all point in the same direction. And that direction, he believes, is now clear. Not toward industrial revival, but toward financial empire. Not toward fair trade, but toward engineered dependence. Not toward sovereignty, but control. Michael Hudson challenges us to rethink everything we think we know about tariffs, not just as tools of trade, but as weapons of class strategy, not just as national defense mechanisms, but as instruments of economic control. In the public debate, tariffs are presented as patriotic, populist, even heroic. But beneath the surface, they reveal something far more calculated: a slow, deliberate reshaping of the American and global economies to favor capital over labor, finance over industry, speculation over stability. What's at stake isn't simply the price of goods or the state of trade balances. It's the structure of power, the very rules that determine who wins, who loses, and who decides. And that's why this conversation matters. Because as tariffs rise and markets shift, so too does the balance between democracy and oligarchy, sovereignty and subservience. Hudson doesn't ask us to reject tariffs, but to understand them, to look past the rhetoric and follow the results. Because ultimately, the question isn't whether tariffs work, it's who do they work for? In that answer lies the future of economics, and perhaps the future of democracy itself.